How you doing there? Just a quickie before we start. On the Apple podcast, why don't you double click on David McWilliams Plus? It's right there when you open the podcast. You get ad-free, you unlock early access. Just double click and away you go. David McWilliams Plus. You get this pure and simple. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you, Ed?
I'm good. I'm suffering a little bit from imposter syndrome.
Well, go on.
It's Kilkenomics. So Kilkenomics is economics and comedy. And
Yes.
I'm neither one. I'm neither an
You're
economist.
better
or a
than
coach.
both, Johnny boy. You're better than both.
It reminded me of what Katie Martin said on the podcast last week when she said, she was talking about Liz Truss, who never suffered from imposter syndrome.
I know.
44 days in the job.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you could say that about a lot of our politicians. I mean, there's fellas go up and talk economics in this country where you do have a little bit of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
a
yeah,
little
yeah,
bit,
yeah.
you know. But this is the first time we've taken the podcast outside the M50. So we're, exactly, My father was one of these people who, thought that the world didn't exist beyond Newlands Cross. He'd break out in a rash. And my mother's from Cork. And we used to go down to Cork years ago. And it's amazing when you think about it. 2 adults, 3 kids and a dog in a Mini.
In a Mini.
Down to Cork, right? With
an Austin princess.
Oh, well, that's when we went up market.
Yeah.
That was the very first evidence that Ireland was going to the credit boom. The McWilliamses borrowed the car money. But how are you doing, Ed?
I'm good. Listen, I was listening to what you were saying there.
God love you.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this paradigm shift.
Yeah, and it really is one.
Yeah. So in the last, 15 years, we've had low interest rates, low taxes, low inflation, even deflation.
Yeah.
We've had globalization. We've had China emerging as a big powerhouse. We've had happy Germans using all the Russian gas.
Happy Germans.
That kind of stuff. But now, Mac, all the talk is about the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, I mean, John, it's almost the opposite. So if you look at economics through sort of big epochs, which I much prefer to do than look at like what happened last night or yesterday or whatever. I think it's better to look at it over, a 30 or 40 year span, because that gives you a sense of what's going on in the world. So if you think beginning, let's say, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have this period where inflation begins to fall and fall very rapidly, largely, John, because the global workforce expands enormously because the Chinese enter the game.
Yeah.
So we're looking at basically the global supply of labor going from 3 people to 5 worldwide. That, of course, has this deflationary impact. So that's the number one thing. Number 2 thing, of course, you have everyone's cozying up to Russia. So Russia is providing reasonably cheap energy for Western economies. So you've got 2
Kind of bringing them into the fold.
Bringing them into the fold, you've got this sort of change. And I was there during the time between Yeltsin, first of all, Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, then Putin. And Putin was meant to go, but he stuck around, and then he's meant to go again, and he's around and around. But for us in the West, the impact was that the Russians were giving us cheap energy. The West was quite happy. And when I say the West, the Europeans were very, very happy to be friendly to the Russians. Not as friendly as Gerhard Schröder in Germany, who took it to an nth degree. He took friendship very seriously, right? But
He was a little too trusting.
he was very, very trusting.
Yeah.
I think his pockets were just lined, in fairness. I think it's a much easier...
See, the guy ended up as Gazprom
he's
on the board, wasn't he?
He's the guy who ended up Gazprom, but I think the best thing about him was he used to be called the Audi man in Germany. And I said to my German friends, why is that? I thought, he must have driven an Audi, but he was married 5 times. So we had 5 little rings, right?
Brilliant.
But the fucker married a 6th time, so they couldn't call it. So that's the deflation, right? And so that brings interest rates coming down. And I used to work in the city of London, years ago, and the interest rates were coming down, inflation's coming down, energy prices are coming down. All the time you have globalization expanding, of which Ireland has done extremely well at it. That's the thing to keep in the back of our heads. And then, of course, America and China are on very good terms.
Yeah.
And the Chinese are saying to the Americans, we'll provide you with lots of cheap stuff. You buy the cheap stuff, You guys then will have a kick to your living standards. And the Americans say, well, what happens? We'll run a budget deficit. The Chinese say, don't worry, we'll buy all your paper, right? So there's this thing that they were going to call Chimerica, which is, I think, one of those...
Brangelina.
Like Brangelina, exactly, like Brangelina, right? So that's the world up until COVID.
Yeah.
That's the world up until COVID. I think since COVID, that world has completely and utterly changed. So the biggest change to Europeans is that Russia is now an elemental threat to Europe, right? The war in Ukraine is, it was said last night, is the end of an empire.
Yeah.
And the beginning of a new country, which is why I don't think the Ukrainians are going to like fold and do a deal. I think it'll be very, very difficult, right? So first of all, Russia has gone not only from being a friend and an ally, but to being an enemy, an explicit enemy, where the prospect of a further war is so evident that we'd be crazy to dismiss it. China has gone from being a friend to an enemy of the United States. And we are in the American camp, whether we like it or not. I largely like it, but I know some people don't, right? Crucially though, inflation has emerged. And as inflation emerges, the rate of interest goes up from having been very, very low. And the thing about the rate of interest being very, very low is that when the rate of interest is zero, it means that almost every financial decision that is taken is wrong. Because you cannot value anything when the rate of interest is zero, because your cost of capital is zero. So consequently, everything then becomes overvalued. Now, the most explicit example of that today is tech stocks, okay? Tech stocks are collapsing. And I was actually, I was reading on Twitter about people who work in Twitter and what's happening to their lives now is,
Well, 50% of them have been laid off today. And by the way, because I was looking at this as well, 90% of the workforce in Twitter Asia have been laid off, which is just extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. So you see what's happening. So all those tech companies, which are probably they're not even a bellwether, but they're a leading indicator of what can happen in the real world, because that's not the real world.
Yeah.
That tech bro stuff is not the real world.
It's not just a bellwether, it's a bell end who's running it. But anyway.
Yeah, it's some sort of bizarre combination of what I always say about like Bitcoin, economics and Scientology put together. You know? And when you get Scientology, man, it's all weird. It's all weird. But if you think about all these things, these are indicative of the world changing. And when I say changing, moving from one status quo to another status quo.
Yeah.
So you can see it in valuations. You can see it in countries. You can see it in countries like what happened in the UK in the last couple of weeks. I was explaining to Katie Martin about it today. I said, she said to me, I know we're in a really bad place, David. And I said, why? She goes, not only are you Irish not laughing at us, you're sympathizing now. Yeah.
And that's a paradigm shift.
I said, that's another paradigm shift, right? I said, exactly. You're absolutely right, darling. And we will just stay for the whole weekend. You poor thing. Okay. So what is happening is we've got a massive change in geopolitics.
Yeah.
We have a massive change in economics. We have a massive change in financing and the rate of interest stroke inflation. Okay. Look at them both together. And we have an unfortunate belief in the ability of central bankers to fix the problem.
The old central bank.
You may have been watching The Late Late the other night, John. I know you're a real loser and you don't go out. But allegedly, Christine Lagarde.
Oh, your friend. You're a big fan, I know.
Big fan. She was asked by Ryan Tubridy a question that you would imagine that she would have been briefed beforehand. Where did the old inflation come from, Christine? Yeah. And she goes...
Came out of nowhere.
She goes... that's exactly what she said. She says, came out of nowhere. Now, like... If you're in Kettler's pub and the fella behind the bar says it came out of nowhere, that's grand. Then it's 2 pints and whatever you're having yourself. But when the chief bottle washer of the ECB says it came out of nowhere, you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And you're this person who's supposed to fix this thing that came out of nowhere? So those things...
But in fairness, though, inflation has been a bit of a shock. Initially... Everyone was saying that it's just as a result of the pandemic and it will all, supply chains are disrupted and all that kind of stuff. And that'll all smooth out and then inflation will get. But of course, Ukraine and Putinflation and all that kind of stuff has really kicked in. But let me ask you this, though, Mac. You know, it does seem to be quite sudden, in fairness to Christine Lagarde.
Yes.
It didn't come out of nowhere, but it is quite sudden.
Could have said that. She could have said, look, it's actually to do with supply chain problems of as you said, John, you should have been on the Late Late.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go for her job next.
You should have, when the call came through for the researcher, and I've had the Late Late researcher, I'd say hello. He'd say, hello, it's John O'Toole here from the Late Late. I was like, oh, no, I'm washing my hair that night. But go on.
But these are all cycles, economic cycles, high inflation, low inflation, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But has it ever been so sudden?
Well,
in the way it has been now.
Well, it's interesting. Inflation, it has in 1973 and 74.
A bit of history. We love a bit of history on the podcast.
Right? A little bit of history. You get inflation, and our parents will remember that, and certainly even the grandparents will remember that you get this extraordinary spike up in energy prices, exactly like what is happening now. And it was a result of a massive military conflict between the Israelis on one side and the Arabs on the other side. Now, the West came in unambiguously in support of Israel, led by America, Britain, and then France. And of course, the Arabs said, okay, if that's your game, what we're going to do is we're going to actually tighten the supply. John, you and I remember, because we were kids, that the worst thing you could ever do in the McWilliams household was leave on the immersion. And the feckin'...
I still check it from time to time.
Yeah. Having a bath with your sisters, not at the same time, but after them, right? And I always remember my favorite memory of that is the Rumble in the Jungle. The Rumble in the Jungle was a fight, a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. And it was on the last weekend of October of 1974.
There's a great doco on that, actually.
My dad, as I told you this before, went down to Eddie Totterdell's rentals of TVs. This is when Irish people used to rent our TVs, you remember that? And he got a colour TV. And we went home, and about 5 families on the road came in, and it was on the middle of the night, because it had to be aired for American network TV at 10 p.m. New York time for maximum ad. So it was on in Dunleary at about 3 in the morning, which was the most exciting thing in the world.
I think your mum went out and bought a really big teapot for all the families.
My mum did, yeah, she did. There's a big, massive teapot. It's like one of those samovars they have in Russia. Exactly. But the worst thing, anyway, and we all came and we watched the fight. Before I tell you the fight, the worst thing was I came home the next day expecting to watch Tom and Jerry in colour, and my dad gave the fucking thing back. I mean, how bad is that for a 6-year-old kid? You told all your mates in national school, we got a colour TV.
And it was because he lost money on the fight.
It was probably, yeah. But the fight is interesting for a variety of reasons. The one reason, in the context of what we're talking about here, is you ask, why was this fight, the Rumble in the Jungle, in Zaire? Okay. Now, why was it in Zaire? And this is exactly what's happening now, was because the oil crisis precipitated an enormous transfer of money from oil-consuming countries like us to oil and commodity-producing countries like the Middle East.
Yeah.
But what happened is the money went into the Middle East, and the Middle East was a very underdeveloped economy. All the Middle Eastern economies were very, very small. So they couldn't spend all this lolly. So they said, okay, well, what do we do with all this lolly? What do we do with all this money? And those lovely people, American investment bankers...
This is before they would invest in things like golf and...
This is before golf. This is football teams in Chelsea and Newcastle and...
Live golf.
Yeah, exactly. All that nonsense. But the money then went to the American banking system. And the American bankers said, well, hold on, where we lend this money? Do you know we lend it? We lend it to really poor countries that produce commodities. Because their prices are going up as energy prices. So a fellow called Mobutu, who did a very good line in leopard skin hats.
Yes.
He decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm a proper dictator. I'm going to have either the Olympics, the World Cup, or the heavyweight boxing championship. So he went and talked to Don King, and they paid the purse. But the thing at the time was Muhammad Ali was coming out of retirement.
Yeah.
Okay. Muhammad Ali was 35 years old, right? Now in boxing, unless of course you're Tyson Fury, which is a totally different beast, right?
Yeah.
Being 35 at that stage, he was against Foreman, who was 21. So the difference is the bookies...
Oh, right, okay.
The bookies stopped taking bets against Ali because everyone thought he was going to lose. And not only going to lose, he was going to be beaten because Foreman had actually hammered a guy called Ken Norton and a guy called Joe Fraser, both of whom had hammered Ali. He had the biggest punch. He was the strongest guy. And he had this enormous punch that knocked out Fraser 3 times in one round. Okay, and Fraser was a big guy. So everyone thought that Ali, this would be his last fight and he'd take the purse and go home. But Ali kept saying, no, I am the greatest and I'm going to win. People said, yeah, this is all, this is...
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
All that sort of stuff. Yeah,
he was brilliant. He was one of the best orators.
This is hip-hop, trash talking before McGregor, okay? Yeah. And which was, when it was nice.
But it was proper funny stuff.
It was funny. It was humorous. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, what happened was they get out into the ring and nobody could understand how can Ali go more than 3 or 4 rounds with this guy. This guy is going to kill him. They get into the ring and everyone says, well, maybe, if he could just go 4 or 5 rounds against this guy, maybe he could have a chance because boxing is apparently very psychological. It's a lot of psychological.
Actually, let me tell you about it. I'm a boxer myself at this stage.
You are he's the Adonis of Dunleary. Exactly. But Ali goes in and at the beginning of the fight, they're all meant to be, shaping up against the other. Ali starts bouncing up and down against the ropes like this, right? And nobody can understand, what the hell is he doing? What the hell is he doing, right? He's bouncing up and down against the ropes. Now, what he'd figured out was the following, that the humidity in Kinshasa, in Zaire, was so intense that it affected the flexibility of the rubber in the ropes. And it made the rubber in the ropes more liable to dissipate the power because the ropes were more flexible of the incoming punch. So Ali lay on the ropes and he started getting pummeled by Foreman. So everyone thought Foreman was going to kill him. But Foreman started to visibly tire. And you'll see Ali, if you actually watch the movies, go, is that all you got, Georgie? You is ugly and you're not okay. So he's really getting on his nerves. But what happens, they'd figured out a way that if Ali lay on the ropes, he could dissipate the power of the punches through his body onto the ropes and out.
It's quite a scientific, physics-based idea.
Angelo Dundee, right? Now, he used to call this was the great story, he called rope the dope.
Yeah.
Right? He goes, you is a dope, okay? And then he wrote the dope. Now, the point was, the only way he could win this was if he could sustain enough power to the point where the very power that Foreman was hitting him with started to tire Foreman himself out more than Ali. And you see, if you watch the 4th round, the 5th round, he starts to tire, the 6th round starts to, and in the 7th round, Ali knocks him out. And he knocks him out because he used his very strength against him. Now, the reason this intrigues me as a story is not just because it was located around the time that inflation and energy prices... And energy... Exactly, John. It's because Ali had a strategy going into that fight. And Ali understood that without a strategy, there's no way in the world he could win.
Right.
But with a strategy, he had a chance. Now, the reason that always appeals to me, that idea, is that countries are the same. If a country goes into a change in the global economy, like the change we're going through now, and if a country goes into that change and is aware of what's going on, but doesn't decide, hold on a second, we need to change our strategy, that country will get destroyed. And what I've always said, and it's this idea that good countries can go bad.
Yeah.
And the reason good countries can go bad is that good countries are only good or decent places to live because you make more right decisions than wrong decisions. So the reason for us now in Ireland, and in broader Europe, wherever your allegiances lie, is that we are now at that sort of 4-man approach. The world has changed, and we've got to say, okay, well, what do we do about it? What is Europe going to do about it? Because, what you saw in Britain last week, Britain is a country without a strategy. And what is terrifying is that Britain could be everyone. There's nothing uniquely bad about Britain, but it's a country without a strategy that decided to go off on its Sweeney Todd and experiment. And the people who were lending money said, we don't believe you.
Well, isn't this, I mean, this is something that we touched on before as well, is that the strategy they had was akin to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Sorry. Okay, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah, well, that's
because that sums up the British government and Liz Truss in particular.
It's very important for us to be aware of that, Niall, because everyone, this thing can happen it could happen to us too. You know, we could make Dunning-Kruger is
I love this.
Okay, this is the more obscure reading of 1975, I think it is, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
A man goes into there's cameras everywhere in a bank. And he holds up the bank with a gun. But he has no balaclava on.
Or stocking or anything.
Stocking. And he then winks at the camera and walks off. So the coppers arrive in and they say, and by the way, this guy's rather large. It's very, you'd notice this fella. Big guy. So the coppers arrive in and the one behind the thing, so that's your man Mick from down the road. He says, where does he live? Oh, the second flat down there. Yeah, he's around. I see him around the town. I see him the off license every night. No, nice enough fella. So the coppers arrive on his door and Mick opens the door and coppers say, we'd like to bag you for that, for robbing the bank. And Mick says, how did you know? I was wearing the juice. And the copper says, what do you mean you're wearing the juice, right? This guy was a genius, obviously. And he had thought, do you remember when we were in school, you could have invisible ink, right? And the invisible ink, if you put lemon juice on the invisible ink, right, you could actually wipe out all the ink, right? So he thought that if he put lemon juice on his face, he'd wipe his face out, okay? And his face would go invisible. And it was during the time The Invisible Man was on telly.
That's right, yeah. Right? One of my favourite programmes.
Yes, John was that guy, okay. And so he winked at the camera because he thought he was invisible. And so this was a story. People got a bit of a laugh. But some psychiatrist looked at it, a psychologist looked at it and said, now, isn't this very interesting? This is indicative of an idea that we see all the time in the world, which is the truly incompetent always overestimate their competence. So people who really have no rashers think they're geniuses.
Yeah.
And it's actually much more prevalent in men than women.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Very much so, right? No, it is.
But I thought they were going to change this to the Liz Truss effect now.
No. But it's much more prevalent. And that's the sort of thing that happened in the UK. And I do believe, the Boris Johnsons, the Brexiteers, and all those people, it's the Dunning-Kruger, ultra-extreme male, ridiculous notion that you know more than you do and you can just bluff your way through it. And if you see in policy, these guys, Liz Truss and her friends were regarded as people who understood the markets. This was their whole thing. We believe in market fundamentally. They had no rashers. What was going on? And we saw what happened. That their government collapsed because of the Dunning-Kruger. Now, my point is that what global economics tells you, the most important lesson is humility.
Yeah.
That the global economy, I've always thought, from listening to the podcast, I think it behaves like an evolutionary system, much more like biology than physics, even though most of economics believes it's physics. And that's what I grew up learning and I studied, and then I ended up teaching in university. And then over time, I thought, no, this looks much more like biology to me. And what I mean is that the economy evolves and products evolve and people evolve and we adapt and we change and we move on. And one of the basic ideas of all evolutionary biologists is that evolution is cleverer than you.
Yeah.
Right? That basically you can't really change what's going on, but you can just adapt to it.
Yeah.
But there's always something clever. And I think that, in Ireland now, if we are going from this one state of the global economy to another state, I think it's important for us to start to think of adapting to it, changing, because, one thing that has been brilliantly revealing and I think unbelievably positive in John and our lifetimes, now that we're 110 between us, which is kind of shocking.
Soon to be 111.
Soon to be 111. I think what is the fantastic change in our country. Most of it, we'll talk about some of the negatives, but most of it largely positive. And most of it, I believe, a matter of some strategy, some luck. Luck is hugely important.
Yeah.
And the fact that And I've always said it, that we became a liberal, tolerant, kinder, more open society. So what I'm saying is that we had geopolitics, which was on our side, which was the multinationals, the cheap energy, the opening up of supply chains, all that sort of stuff that we could fit into it. But never underestimate the power of the local dynamism and tolerance and liberalism. And it sounds really sappy, but love, just saying to people, we love you. Stay here. It's okay. It's okay to be
nurtured.
Different. And I think that these are the sort of things we've got to think about in this next 10 years, to have that strategy.
Let's move on a little bit and staying with Ireland, because there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. I was reading during the week, the recent exchequer returns came in.
Oh, yeah.
And as dull as they are, I did find myself reading them going, wow, like, what's going on here?
What happened to John? John used to sit me down when we were kids and say, listen, you won't believe it, man, in a week's time, David Bowie is going to, release, this. Now he's saying, do you know the exchequer returns? What have I done to you?
I know.
What have I done to you?
It's the last 3 years of this podcast, I've become an economics student under the tutelage of Professor McWilliams.
You poor
and look what you've done to me.
I know. Christ. These are the great chat-up lines you have in the bars now. Hi, I'll tell you about the exchequer returns.
But here's my question. I have a couple of questions. One is, there has been a surplus, up until the end of September, the surplus, exchequer returns, it was 7.9 billion euro, which is enormous. And, the tax revenue is nearly 60 billion, all that kind of stuff. So it seems weird to talk about the cost of living crisis in the context of these massive returns.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying before about decisions being made and people making good and bad decisions, 7.9 billion is something that could be ploughed into the HSC, or the thing that we always go on about is housing.
Housing, yeah. Well, the interesting thing about economics is it's counterintuitive, right? So sometimes when you think black, it actually ends up being white. So the reason the exchequer returns are so high now is precisely because of the cost of living crisis. So the exchequer returns are, if you have very, very low inflation, you're going to have very, very low exchequer returns because all they are is tax revenue. When inflation starts to rise, the actual tax revenue in euros starts to rise. Yeah. So you'd probably be better to deflate the exchequer returns for dollars to see actually what's happening. So what you actually see is that when you're in a sort of inflationary boom, as we are at the moment, everything is effervescent, right? Everything's kind of bubbly. And so tax revenue comes in, etc. And of course, one of the dilemmas in Ireland is that when we have a budget deficit, we really know what to do. So if the target is to cut, we know how to cut. But when you have a largesse, so for example, during the last downturn, there was even a thing called board snip that economists took like some sort of pride in being a part of.
Yeah.
So we'll cut that and we'll cut this and it's macho. When you're given almost the manna from heaven of having a surplus, what you find is that economists tend to run out of ideas. We're almost programmed. It's a bit like the Dunning-Kruger in reverse. We're programmed to be negative and to say, oh, Jesus, that surplus will disappear. It's all over. I take the opposite view. I just think that, so at the moment, the economy has a huge, huge amount of surplus cash in it. And the tax take is enormous. And we have a choice what to do with it, right? Now, I believe that what we should do is put it into a sovereign wealth fund, right? And a bit like the Norwegians do. But this.
And what would you do with that then?
How so for example, you take what is happening right now with all these tech stocks that are falling, all the stock markets that are falling, etc. Right? This is going to be a reasonably short-lived thing, right? Okay. And what I mean by that is inflation will at some stage begin to moderate. Even now, I believe gas prices in Europe are beginning to fall quite rapidly. And the reason is the following. This is the idea that they say in energy markets that the cure to high prices is high prices. And what they mean by that is that what happens in energy markets when the price of oil goes above $100 a barrel, lots and lots of oil production, gas production, or whatever it happens to be, that was unbelievably unprofitable to drill for becomes much more profitable.
Yeah.
And so what you see a massive increase in supply, but that comes later. So the consequence of increases in oil prices tends typically to be gluts in energy, not scarcity, a couple of years later. So I think what you're going to find is that the rate of inflation will fall as energy prices fall, maybe even quicker than people think, right? Now, if that happens, it's always this idea of when is the moment to buy assets?
Yeah.
And it always struck me that the moment to buy assets is when they are extremely cheap, not when they're expensive. That's the basic idea of how to get reasonably well off.
Kind of obvious, though, isn't
Well,
it?
it is kind of obvious, but you look at the Irish state, we do the opposite. So, for example, the Irish state bought Stripe at $92. Okay, Stripe now maybe is worth $7 a share,
okay.
right? The Irish state, when we had zero interest rates, didn't borrow for houses. They're going to borrow now when interest rates will be at 4 or 5%. So, I mean, there is a sort of a madness. And, you know, it's this...
Is that a central bank thing or a government thing?
No, I'll tell you what it is. It's what I call, John, good room thinking.
Right,
Right?
okay.
I don't know if you remember, we in our family had a good room.
Yeah, so did we, actually.
Yeah, and our good room was...
With a case of kind of silver and delf and stuff that was never touched.
Never touched,
Ever
never touched. My granny had a good room in West Cork, okay? That was so good that I wasn't good enough to go into it. So, like, it was good for other people, but our family wasn't good enough. And after Mass, she ran a little pub as well. And after Mass on a Sunday, when we used to go down there for summer, because we were kind of basically, we were just deployed down to our granny for the whole summer. But I remember on a Sunday morning, the good room would be opened. And there would be a big ceremony, big key. And we walk into the good room. And in the good room, there'd be Waterford cut glass, right? And that side. And then there'd be what I would call a bragging wall, right? And on the bragging wall were relations who went to university, right? And there was one lad, okay, in a big mortarboard, right? And to this day, we've no idea who he was, right? Having a rashers, like Granny bought it in a sale of work, some fella from New Zealand or something. And it was myself and my three cousins. I have triplet cousins, right? Who were known as the Three Twins, right? Because they're actually real triplets in the 60s born. And the people in Ballivorny, it's a little Irish-speaking village down in West Cork. They couldn't get their head around triplets. So they were called the Three Twins. Come here, lad. See those three twins, lad? Okay. And there are people that my mother describes as incomprehensible in 2 languages, right? And so we'd be down there, and after Mass, the good room be open for the good people. The whole point of the good room, John, was that my granny was pretending to be rich, and the really rich people were pretending that she was. And that's how the status quo in rural Ireland maintained itself. So the rich people said, oh, yes, we know that you guys drink out of Waterford glass every day. We do know that, clearly. And you sit around here. And we know that that person over there is actually one of your relations from the UCD or UCC motorboat. So it was this pretense, right? It was this idea that we aren't good enough, right? Now, that good room thinking has gone in Ireland in terms of our grannies and things. But the mentality that we're not quite good enough remains. And the only place it remains is within the civil service. It doesn't remain out in the street. It doesn't remain in the private sector. It remains the people who are making policy decisions. And the thing about making policy decisions is you do have to upset some people, right?
Right.
So the idea is, for example, if we come back to what do we do with the surplus? I think we should follow the Norwegian idea. Buy up when they're cheap, but also knowing that you're never going to be too clever that you get it right all the time. But buy up the stocks of the multinationals who actually are here and have a parallel wealth fund. Now, what that does is the Norwegians use that as a pension fund for older people. I think we should...
They're financed for 300 years or something.
They are fine, yeah. So it's a very good place to get old.
Yeah.
But there's a whole life before you get old, right? And I think what we should have is a startup fund. So one of the dilemmas for all societies as we go into this new world is how do we become more flexible, more adaptable, less entrenched in our views, and less clinging on to old ways of doing things. And the best way to do that is to actually create a much more entrepreneurial culture where people back themselves in small companies. Now, the dilemma for most young Irish people trying to start on their own is not the idea, is not the market because we can export, it's access to capital.
Yeah.
Because the banking system will not lend. So the banks will only lend to you if you have a house down the road and they can take that house as collateral if you lose your job. So that, right? So the idea would be to use that part of that wealth fund. You know, we're talking, 7-8 billion euros a year becomes material after a while. Turns into a lot of money. Use that wealth fund for every single individual in this country in order to use as collateral. So you can't
does that work then?
So you can't just go down to Clears and blow it all, right?
Yeah.
Although that would be very attractive. Okay, we might do that later. But so what you would do is if people came up with a good idea, right, but they had no capital, they could pledge the shares in the wealth fund against that.
Yeah.
So it completely, for the banking system, de-risks the person.
Right.
So the person goes bust, the idea doesn't work, the bank then has the shares in Apple or whatever it happens to be, right? So therefore, for the bank manager, it's a sort of an easy win. You de-risk it, you create the capital. The idea is that you take the capital from the inert capital in a fund to make it live. And it's by making it live that you give people the chance to actually express themselves and create new things. And then it's much more likely that society is going to be flexible in the face of all these economic sort of missiles that are going to come in at us as we've articulated, because we're moving from this phase to that phase. And what it also does is it completely changes the psychology of the nation. And once you change the psychology of the nation, there's no going back.
But so is the problem then just in the decision-making process where, you're saying that we missed the boat when it came to borrowing to sort out our housing issue when interest rates were zero. But was just afraid that, are people like the civil servants or the central bankers afraid that they're going to fuck up, basically?
Well, fucking up is a big fear.
Oh, no, absolutely it is. But it shouldn't be the...
No, it shouldn't be. No, they just don't have the experience. I mean,
how do you get the experience?
Well, this is what I'm saying. So rather than decide there's going to be some overarching sort of genius, I think the Greeks used to call him the warrior sage, right?
Yeah.
Give the money to people and let them decide. The whole idea of a wealth fund should be for the people, not for the people when we retire, but for the people when they're young. I mean, people need money much more when they're 21 than when they're 71.
Right.
As a general idea, right?
Absolutely.
And they can work, and so this is what I think we could try to think about, is really using what's going on in the world to, it's the rope the dope strategy. It's to come back to Ali. It's to say, we're going into battle here. Okay, we're a small country. We're not muscular. We don't have an army. We are dependent on people. We're not price makers. We're price takers in most things. However, we're going to make a few little small decisions here. And those small decisions here are going to create a totally different type of society, but a different type of society that doesn't threaten anyone. That's the key, that you're not threatening people. One of the dilemmas with big ideas is they tend to be based on you're going to get this, you're going to get this, somebody is threatened, and then we all, like the Northern Ireland thing, that's the thing to avoid, the plague, right? So it strikes me that these types of ideas are the types of ideas that can profoundly change generations of people. And they're not that difficult. And the risk is very low because the surplus we talk about is a windfall. By definition, a surplus is a windfall because you didn't fucking expect it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like finding a fiver in a pub.
Yeah.
Right? It is. It's the economic equivalent of bending down and saying, gee, there's 50 euros.
Yeah.
Then you've got the choice. Do you give it back or do you put it in your pocket? It's up to you. But do you see what I mean? It's serendipitous.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we should be trying to do here, because what I always think about Ireland is, with the exception of housing is the big issue, we have got a lot of things right in the last 30 years in comparison to our peers, but I think what's much more important in comparison to where we came from.
Yeah.
I'm always going back to the 80s in my head and where we were and how so many people emigrated and how people just didn't have anything. So where we came from is profoundly
Well, it's
important.
happening again. I mean,
it is happening.
You're Lucy, my Maggie, you know, I'm
But
sure
it's
my
happening.
Izzy and everyone else is going to head off.
And one of the things is housing, and we need to fix that by absolutely identifying that's the number one priority.
Yeah.
And also having the courage to make the simple idea that when you walk around Kilkenny, or certainly Dublin, or any town, and you see dereliction, that is
absolutely
indicative of a destroyed system. Because there you have assets. I've always said dereliction is a function of wealth, not poverty. Because only the truly wealthy can allow an asset in a housing boom to degenerate like that. And what you basically have to do is make that expensive, make the use of land expensive. So by making land expensive, again, counterintuitively, what it does is it makes people bring that land into use, because not using the land is what it'll actually cost you. So if we have what's called a site value tax on all land, not agricultural land, but all urban land, what you will find is that it will cost you to leave that site fallow. It will cost you to leave that site go derelict. So all that unsightly urban destruction that we see in Ireland would, at a stroke, become expensive. That would focus the minds of the people who own that. And at the same time, encourage people to do that stuff up. So use the tax system to identify what the problem is. The interesting thing about the site value tax, it's the one tax in the world that almost all economists agree is a good one, which is why it's never been done, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But, you know, so by doing those sort of small things, they're not big things.
Well, it's what we've always said is that the greatest impediment to Irish economic growth is housing. It's not so much finance. It's not. No. It's housing. And John, sorting our housing.
But John, the thing is, these things are fixable, and the only reason you have permanent problems is people don't care enough.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't care; they don't care enough. And it strikes me that you get this right, you try and create something out of the surplus, something material, and you're kind of on your way again. You're making all the right decisions. But I think the British experience in the last couple of weeks should be cautionary for us. Indeed. And the cautionary lesson is that our neighbour, which was much bigger, much stronger, and 40 years ago, miles ahead of us on every metric, has, because of very bad decisions made progressively by a more out of touch, bizarre, at the end of the day, elite, okay? Actually, they all went to Oxford and all went to Eton, right? Has turned into a country that actually doesn't know what it's doing. And when you don't know what you're doing, like our friend Ali and Foreman, you go into the ring, because the global economy is the ring.
Yeah.
If you don't know what you're doing, you'll get slapped down. But if you know what you're doing, you have a chance. And we just got to give ourselves a chance.
Indeed.
Thank you.